and this is Writers' Voices with Monica and Caroline. And I am still Monica Hadley, and with me is still Caroline Kilborn.
On a beautiful day in June
2017, if you happen to be listening to this as a podcast at some future date. And Caroline, why don't you introduce our next guest?
This guest is Mugambi, is that what it? Mugambi Jouet, and he teaches at Stanford Law School. His writing has been featured in Mother Jones, State, The New Republic, San Francisco Chronicle, Huffington Post, Salon, The Hill, Liberation, Le Monde, and academic journals. He has traveled extensively within America and internationally, and this book is very interesting.
And the title is Exceptional America, What Divides Americans from the World and from Each Other by Mugambi Jouet. Welcome to Writers' Voices, Mugambi.
Thank you so much.
So tell us how you came to write this particular book.
I was trying to answer three fundamental questions. How did America go from Barack Obama to Donald Trump? Why America is so intensely polarized? And how is explained by American exceptionalism?
Which brings us to, of course, the key question. What is American exceptionalism?
Most people today think that American exceptionalism means a faith in American superiority. Exceptionalism as exceptional, meaning outstanding, phenomenal, or superior. But that is not what American exceptionalism has primarily meant historically. It's primarily been a descriptive concept, especially compared to other Western nations, that America being an exception. For example, America is the only Western democracy today to still have the death penalty and the only one to lack a universal health care system. And these are dimensions of what American exceptionalism has historically meant. And they're not inherently good or bad. It depends on what you think of the death penalty and universal health care. And what I argue in my book is that the extraordinary polarization of modern American society is a dimension of what American exceptionalism truly means, because Americans are routinely clashing over a broad range of issues that are either not controversial or much less controversial elsewhere in the Western world.
Well, I think we've all seen the how that's played out in the last few decades, at least. And I think, we tend to have a tendency to think that at some time in the past, Americans were all more on the same page about things, that we all were in agreement about things. But if you look at history, that's not really the case, is it?
There were periods of greater or lesser polarization in American history. So it's true that there were times when people were in greater agreement about, say, economic issues. After Franklin Roosevelt introduced the New Deal model, it became very popular with both Democrats and Republicans, and there was greater consensus that the government had the responsibility to provide for the basic economic well-being of the American people. That being said, that started to shift more or less in the 1980s due to a number of different factors, and the polarization of American society today under Donald Trump is not new. America also is very polarized under the presidencies of George W. Bush and Barack Obama, for example.
Well, I think even, we may look back and think that there was a lot of agreement around FDR, but I happen to have an old family scrapbook full of articles denouncing FDR for those very things. So
everybody agreed with FDR, and also were clashes over a broad range of issues in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. But it's still worth noting that, say, Dwight Eisenhower, who was a Republican president, of course, did not have a fundamental quarrel with many of the big picture ideas of the New Deal, of the government having a duty to provide for the basic economic well-being of the American people. And in fact, the top income tax rate under Eisenhower was approximately 90%, whereas under Obama, the highest it got in terms of income taxes was 39%. So there was much greater consensus on some economic issues in the age of Eisenhower or even Nixon, for example, than later years.
So you feel the polarization is worse now than it was during those time periods?
That is supported by empirical data. As I describe in my book, political scientists have found that the degree of partisan polarization in Congress during the Obama years reached its highest level since the Reconstruction era following the Civil War. And we see that during the Trump presidency, there's an intensification in different ways of polarization, very significant clashes about what the country should do and how to resolve its problems, and also a rhetoric used by Mr. Trump, which his supporters find admirable and that many other citizens find extremely troubling.
How, there seems to be a huge acceptance of political leaders now, and I'm referring to Mr. Trump in particular, feeling free to lie and say things that are totally untrue. But there's one section in your book where you quote a number of different politicians and who are saying things that just really aren't true at all, and they're not a matter of opinion; they're objectively untrue. Is this new, or has this always happened at different periods in history?
Propaganda is probably as old as the history of the world, and it's played a big role in European history and in American history as well. That being said, the magnitude of conspiracy theories and blatant falsehoods today in America is really extraordinary by international standards. Claims like climate change being a hoax have much less influence in modern Europe than in America, and incidentally they've played a big role in Donald Trump's decision to step away from the Paris Accord on climate change. When he was on the campaign trail, Donald Trump claimed that climate change was a hoax invented by the Chinese, but we see, and as I describe in my book, that this type of rhetoric was very common well before Donald Trump came onto the picture. Many leaders of the Republican establishment have advanced similar ideas about climate change being a myth, or blatantly false claims about other issues, say universal health care or the tyranny of socialized medicine, which played a big role in rousing people against Obama's healthcare reform. Now, of course, people can have different views about whether healthcare reform was a good idea and how the program was put in place, but what's striking is the influence of blatantly false claims in shaping the debate.
I know. It was so amazing to me that everyone that I know who's on Medicare thinks it's pretty darn good, and it is socialized medicine, basically. So why, I don't see how they bought into this idea that expanding that to other people would be so terrible. That it's...
a form of cognitive dissonance. Indeed, Medicare tends to be a popular program among many citizens, and many would be very much opposed to losing Medicare access. That being said, many of these same citizens are very wary of quote-unquote big government and of expanding access to health care to the rest of the people. And that's partly due to the notion that America simply cannot afford Medicare for all or universal health care because it would be far too expensive. And it's true that in America, the costs of health care is extremely high. That's partly because there are no pricing regulations like in other Western nations. And we see that actually other Western nations, that is, European countries, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, as well as other developed countries like Japan, spend much less than America on healthcare while covering everyone, and that's because healthcare is seen primarily as a public service and a human right, not as a for-profit business in America.
Well, I've always found it interesting that health insurance actually started out as a nonprofit, kind of everybody pitching in together to help people who are having trouble, but then it really wasn't. I did a little research once, and it really wasn't until the 70s that most of the insurance companies started converting to being for profit, and that seems to be the root of a lot of the problem.
It's not only health insurance companies, but also the wider medical industry, from hospitals to pharmaceutical drugs,
right,
are generally treated as for-profit.
I mean, the hospitals all used to be church-related, years ago, or most of them, or church or state. And we do still have some really good state-sponsored hospitals, like University of Iowa Hospital, and still some very good Catholic hospitals, too. But there are a lot more that are private and for profit now. Mugambi, one of the things you have a section in the book where you talk about why people vote against their own economic interest. And in that you say that it's, not just, working class people who vote against their own economic interest by voting for politicians who want to give big tax cuts to the wealthy and cut services, but that a fairly large proportion of the wealthy, in a sense, vote against their economic interests because they're siding with the raising of taxes and providing more services. But I wanted to argue a point with that. I actually think that an enlightened, wealthy person knows that spreading prosperity will benefit them in the long run. So they aren't voting against their own interest.
Yes, it depends how we construe voting against one's self-interest. As you mentioned, and as I explained in the book, there are many citizens who are well-to-do who favor policies that would raise their own taxes and that would reduce wealth inequality for the rest of the country. They're also in favor of policies that would ensure access to abortion or gay rights, which may help explain why they tend to vote Democrat. But of course, looking at the big picture, it may also be in their own economic interest to favor more socioeconomic equality. And as I explained before, with universal health care, actually other Western nations spend much less than the U.S. does. So there's a way to favor broader equality in a way that also helps even privileged people.
Well, that is true. And, I'm primarily a business person. And for me, I know that if the bulk of our people are living hand to mouth and don't have resources, they're not going to be able to buy my products or services. And that in order for an economy to grow, everybody has to benefit, not just those at the top.
Yes, that is the attitude in many other Western nations. But in the U.S., even when people agree about this, there's also a major clash over how to achieve greater economic growth. So usually Republicans tend to think that the best way to do so is to eviscerate the role of government over the U.S. economy, slash taxes, slash regulations, get rid of, Obamacare and other efforts to help people who may be struggling, whereas Democrats tend to think that the best way to achieve prosperity is for the government to play a role in leveling the playing field and in providing meaningful social service programs. Because if you are beset by profound medical problems or with exorbitant medical bills, well, you can't fulfill your individual life goals or even the American dream.
You're listening to Writers' Voices with Monica and Caroline, and we're speaking with Mugambi Jouet, author of Exceptional America, What Divides Americans from the World and from Each Other. I want to talk a little bit about one of the issues that seems to be very close to your heart, which has to do with criminal justice, because you were a defense lawyer for indigent people. And so tell us a little bit about how you came to do that work and what you've learned from it and what message you would like to convey about that.
Right out of law school, I became a public defender, that is, a human rights lawyer defending poor people in criminal court. I was working in Manhattan. I also had a chance to do some work in other parts of the country. And it's really important to understand that today America has mass incarceration on a scale not only unprecedented in American history, but virtually unprecedented in the history of humankind. There are over 2 million people behind bars in America, and also the incarceration rate, is important to understand, is relative to the size of the population. So America incarcerates 5 to 10 times as many people as a percentage of its population than other Western democracies. And that's a good benchmark to evaluate the state of modern American society, because as various thinkers have suggested throughout history, one can really judge a society by entering its prisons. If a society can recognize that even people accused of serious crimes have fundamental human rights, have fundamental human dignity, then that's a good benchmark for where a society should be in terms of not dehumanizing its members. And we see that there are trends historically with the surge in wealth inequality at the same time as a surge in mass incarceration, and they are part of the picture here as well.
Would you say for-profit prisons are part of the problem?
It's hard to tell to what extent they are part of the mass incarceration phenomenon, but they are certainly part of the equation in some level. But there are many prisons that are not for profit that still have a lot of prisoners. So we're not saying that this is the main cause.
Was there a point in our history where you can see where we started going down this path towards mass incarceration? Because it almost seems contradictory to our idea of ourselves as the land of the free, and which would sort of imply maybe fewer laws and fewer people being incarcerated than other countries. Where do you see this trend having begun?
Until the 1970s or so, America had incarceration levels that were relatively comparable to other Western democracies, and then the U.S. prison population skyrocketed, and that was due to a number of different factors, including the surge in wealth inequality and the harshening of social attitudes. There was also a surge in crime in the 60s in particular, but most experts trace mass incarceration not to crime levels itself, but to different ways of thinking about crime. In my book, I look at different parts of the picture, such as the role of race discrimination, the role of class discrimination, the weight of anti-intellectualism in shaping very counterproductive policies, the role of Christian fundamentalism in shaping harsher attitudes towards prisoners as well, and also America's refusal in many ways to adhere to international human rights standards in this area.
You know, it's interesting that Christian fundamentalism would make harsher treatment of prisoners, because the Bible is full of things telling you to be kind to prisoners and to visit people in prison, and that was one of the things Jesus taught. So it's sort of backwards.
There have always been very different conceptions and interpretations of the Bible throughout history, and they also have played a big role in America. So today, America is divided between, on one hand, Christian fundamentalists who are very hardline in their conception of Christianity, and liberal or moderate Christians who have much more
compassion,
liberal positions on these issues, from mass incarceration to social policy as a whole. So it's many Christian Americans have been focused on supporting criminal justice reform, and that's also to be remembered as we talk about the views of those who have reservations about compassion towards people in prison.
You're listening to Writers' Voices, and our guest today is Mugambi Jouet, author of Exceptional America, What Divides Americans from the World and from Each Other. One of the things that I found interesting was, the term American exceptionalism and how that was first used, and it wasn't what most people think. It was by the leader of the U.S. Communist Party.
Yes, most scholars trace the origins of the phrase American exceptionalism to American communists who used the phrase in the early 20th century to argue that the so-called universal laws of Marxism would have to evolve differently because America was an exception, that it had different social and economic conditions. So it did not mean that America is inherently superior. And the phrase American exceptionalism then started being used mostly by academics afterwards who analyzed different unique dimensions of American history, law, culture, etc. And it was not before the Obama presidency that American exceptionalism became widely used in the U.S. Political debate, and that's because leaders of the Republican establishment started routinely accusing Obama of not believing in American exceptionalism and aiming to transform America into Europe, or at best Canada, with his un-American and socialist agenda. And they equated American exceptionalism with a faith in American superiority that Obama allegedly did not have.
Now, Mugambi, you were born in France, is that correct?
No, unlike Barack Obama, I was actually born in Kenya.
Okay, you were born in Kenya and raised in Paris.
Yes, my father is Kenyan and my mother is French.
And you came to the United States to go to college, is that correct?
Yes.
Yes. And so you've been here a number of years. You now are a professor at Stanford Law. Did you have any hesitation about writing this book that some people might see as critical of America? Although I don't see it that way. I do want to say that I see it as just giving some historical and a lot of kind of numerical perspective, a lot of kind of looking at what's really happening, the numbers and the studies and so forth, to some of these issues that we have. And I don't think that examining an issue is necessarily a criticism of the country, but there are people who do. And so did you have any hesitation about, people about putting yourself out there as a critic, as an immigrant, and being a target because of that?
My goal in this book was not to criticize America, but to analyze it and to help understand it. And as I describe, there are many different dimensions of American exceptionalism, some positive ones and some more troubling ones. And I underline that America has made countless contributions to human progress, to the development of democracy and human rights throughout the world, to science, to the arts, to literature, and that many American thinkers have been also models for other countries, from the Founding Fathers to Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt, Martin Luther King, and beyond. And that's what's also interesting. For many foreigners, America is often a model of both what to do and what not to do.
Mm-hmm. So, Mugambi, let's talk a little bit about like how long you spent on this book. It seems very timely because there's a lot of references, of course, to the Obama presidency and also to the Trump presidency. So it seems like you must have written it fairly recently. How long did you work on this?
I started writing the book well before Donald Trump's election. I was trying to make sense of the polarization of American society during the Obama years, and I was seeing the rise of figures like Sarah Palin, of the Tea Party movement, and ultimately of Donald Trump as part of a much broader phenomenon over several decades that itself could be traced to the roots of American exceptionalism, unique dimensions of its history, culture, politics, race relations, religious beliefs, economic attitudes, foreign policy, etc.
So, did you have a publisher, like, before it was even finished? Did you have a publisher lined up? Because getting something that's this timely and to print this quickly is not easy to do.
Yes, I had University of California Press several months before the U.S. Presidential election, and of course we talked about making updates with regard to the outcome of the election before the book went to press. Mm.
And is this your first published book, or have you published others?
It's my first one.
Wow. And is it going to be your only, or is it the first of many?
I hope it's the first of many.
What other things would you like to write books about?
There are many different dimensions of American society that I find highly fascinating. So this is going to give me a lot of room for thought in the future, and also would want to look at whether there are unique dimensions of French society that are worth comparing, and more closely the relationship between America and France, because both countries are nations born of the Enlightenment and of universal ideals of liberty. The founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, actually were ambassadors to France, and what's striking is that they mingled in the circles of the French Enlightenment, and the countries therefore have really common roots, and there have been mutual influences, and that has been forgotten. That's going to be a part of my next project. Ah,
that sounds very interesting. I'd love to take a look at that when you finish. Well, thank you so much for being with us today, Mugambi. And I want to give the title once more, Exceptional America, What Divides Americans from the World and from Each Other. A lot of good information here, a lot of studies, a lot of statistics. It's a heavily footnoted book. Even the footnotes are interesting. And so, Mom, do you have some closing words for us today?
I do. You know, a lie is as powerful as the truth if you can get someone to believe it.
That is unfortunately true.
Yep.
Stay tuned now for Planet Earth, and see you next week on Writers' Voices.